In the blood-soaked annals of medieval justice, few periods in human history have witnessed such creative and systematic brutality as the era spanning from the 12th to the 16th centuries. During this time, punishment was not merely about retribution or deterrence. It was a carefully orchestrated theater of agony, designed to demonstrate the absolute power of authority while providing entertainment for the masses. The medieval mind, shaped by religious extremism, feudal hierarchies, and a profound belief in the necessity of public suffering, created a judicial system that would horrify modern sensibilities with its calculated cruelty and inventive methods of inflicting pain. The philosophical foundation of medieval punishment rested on several interconnected beliefs that made extreme brutality not only acceptable, but morally necessary. The dominant Christian theology of the time taught that earthly suffering was a reflection of divine justice, and that physical pain could purify the soul of the condemned while serving as a warning to potential criminals. This religious justification was reinforced by feudal concepts of honor and hierarchy, which demanded that challenges to authority be met with overwhelming displays of power. The result was a judicial system that viewed mercy as weakness and cruelty as virtue. The public nature of medieval executions was perhaps their most distinctive feature, transforming what we might consider private judicial proceedings into elaborate public spectacles that drew crowds from across entire regions. These events were carefully planned affairs that could last for hours or even days, with the condemned subjected to a progression of tortures designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. The crowds that gathered to witness these punishments were not merely passive observers, but active participants in a communal ritual that reinforced social bonds while demonstrating the consequences of transgression. The case of William Wallace, the Scottish knight whose execution in 1305 became one of the most infamous examples of medieval judicial brutality, illustrates the theatrical nature of these proceedings. Wallace was not simply killed for his rebellion against English rule. He was subjected to the full ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment specifically designed to destroy not just his body, but his very identity as a human being. The process began with his being dragged through the streets of London, tied to a horse, allowing the crowds to see his humiliation and fear. This public degradation was an essential component of the punishment, as it demonstrated that even the mightiest rebel could be reduced to a helpless victim. The actual execution of Wallace followed a precise choreography of cruelty that had been refined over centuries of practice. He was first hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious so that he could experience the full horror of what was to follow. His abdomen was then cut open and his intestines removed and burned before his eyes, a process that could take considerable time if the executioner was skilled enough to keep the victim conscious throughout. Finally, his body was divided into quarters, with each piece sent to a different corner of the kingdom as a warning to other potential rebels. The technical expertise required for such elaborate executions created a specialized class of professional executioners who were both feared and essential to the medieval judicial system. These men, often hereditary in their roles, developed sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy and pain tolerance that allowed them to prolong suffering for maximum effect. Master executioner Henri Sanson of France, whose family served in this capacity for over 150 years, left detailed records of the techniques and tools used in various forms of execution, providing a chilling insight into the scientific approach medieval society took to inflicting pain. The variety of execution methods available to medieval judges was staggering in its creativity and specificity. Different crimes called for different forms of death, with the method of execution serving as a form of symbolic communication about the nature of the transgression. Traitors were drawn and quartered to symbolize the dismemberment of the social order they had attempted to destroy, Heretics were burned alive to purify their corrupted souls with fire. Thieves were hanged to demonstrate their separation from honest society. Each method carried its own ritual significance and required its own specialized equipment and expertise. The economic aspects of medieval punishment were equally important to its social and religious functions. Public executions were major economic events that could bring thousands of visitors to a town, generating revenue for local merchants, innkeepers, and food vendors. The condemned themselves were often required to pay for their own execution, including the cost of the rope, the executioner's fee, and even the wood for their own burning. This commercialization of death created powerful economic incentives for maintaining and expanding the system of brutal punishment. The role of technology in medieval executions was constantly evolving, with new devices and techniques being developed to increase both the efficiency and the spectacle of death. The breaking wheel, introduced in the 13th century, allowed for the systematic destruction of every bone in the victim's body while keeping them alive for hours or even days. The Iron Maiden, though likely more legend than reality, captured the medieval imagination with its promise of death by 1,000 punctures. These devices were not merely tools of execution, but symbols of technological progress applied to the art of inflicting suffering. The psychological impact of witnessing such brutal punishments on medieval society cannot be overstated. Children grew up attending executions as a normal part of community life, becoming desensitized to extreme violence while internalizing the message that authority must never be challenged. The trauma of witnessing such events was considered beneficial, as it was believed to instill proper fear of both earthly and divine justice. This systematic exposure to brutality helped create a society where extreme violence was not only tolerated, but expected as a normal response to transgression. The international nature of medieval punishment culture meant that techniques and innovations in cruelty spread rapidly across Europe and beyond. Executioners traveled between kingdoms, sharing knowledge and techniques, while rulers competed to devise ever more elaborate and terrifying forms of punishment. The Holy Roman Empire became particularly notorious for its creative approaches to execution, with different regions developing their own specialties and refinements to traditional methods. The documentation of medieval punishments in contemporary chronicles and legal records provides a wealth of detail about the actual practice of these brutal executions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Nuremberg Chronicle, and numerous other sources describe executions with clinical precision, noting the duration of suffering, the reactions of crowds, and the effectiveness of different techniques. These records reveal that medieval society was not only comfortable with extreme brutality, but actively interested in perfecting and documenting it. The religious ceremonies that accompanied medieval executions added another layer of complexity to these already elaborate spectacles. Condemned prisoners were expected to confess their sins publicly, seek forgiveness from God and their victims, and demonstrate proper Christian submission to divine will. Those who refused to participate in these religious rituals faced additional tortures designed to force compliance, while those who performed adequately might receive the mercy of a quicker death. The gender-specific nature of many medieval punishments reflected the patriarchal structure of medieval society and its particular anxieties about female transgression. Women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or other crimes against the social order faced punishments specifically designed to target their sexuality and reproductive capacity. The practice of burning women alive for witchcraft, while hanging men for the same crime, reflected deep-seated beliefs about the particular danger posed by female deviance. As the medieval period progressed, the sophistication and brutality of punishment methods continued to evolve, reaching their peak during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, would perfect many of the techniques developed during the earlier medieval period, creating an institutional framework for systematic torture and execution that would persist for centuries. The stage was set for even greater innovations in cruelty as medieval society's appetite for spectacular punishment continued to grow. The medieval period witnessed an unprecedented flowering of technological innovation applied to the art of inflicting pain and death, as craftsmen, engineers, and executioners collaborated to create increasingly sophisticated instruments of torture and execution. These devices, far from being crude implements of barbarism, represented the cutting edge of medieval engineering and metallurgy, designed with scientific precision to maximize suffering while providing spectacular entertainment for the masses. The development and refinement of these instruments reveals a society that approached the infliction of pain with the same systematic methodology that it applied to cathedral construction or military engineering. The breaking wheel, known in German as the Rad, represented perhaps the most technically sophisticated execution device of the medieval period. This massive wooden wheel, typically 8 to 10 feet in diameter, was designed to systematically destroy every bone in the victim's body while keeping them alive for as long as possible. The condemned was tied spread-eagle to the wheel, with their limbs positioned over gaps between the spokes. The executioner would then use an iron bar to methodically break each bone, starting with the fingers and toes and working toward the major limbs and torso. The entire process could take hours, with skilled executioners able to keep victims conscious and screaming throughout the ordeal. The construction of a breaking wheel required considerable expertise and expense, with master carpenters working alongside metal workers to create a device that was both functional and symbolically impressive. The wood had to be seasoned and treated to prevent splintering under the impact of the iron bar, while the metal components needed to be precisely forged to deliver maximum force without breaking themselves. The wheels were often decorated with religious symbols or heraldic devices, transforming instruments of torture into works of art that reflected the power and sophistication of the authorities who employed them. The process of execution by breaking wheel followed a carefully choreographed sequence that maximized both suffering and spectacle. The victim was first stripped naked and tied to the wheel with their limbs stretched to their maximum extension. The executioner would then begin the systematic destruction of bones, typically starting with the extremities and working inward. Between each blow, there would be pauses to allow the crowd to observe the victim's suffering and to permit any final confessions or pleas for mercy. The entire process was designed to last for hours, with the victim remaining conscious for as long as possible. The boiling cauldron represented another pinnacle of medieval execution technology, requiring not only the construction of massive bronze or iron vessels, but also the development of sophisticated heating systems capable of maintaining precise temperatures for extended periods. These cauldrons, some large enough to hold an entire human body, were typically installed in permanent execution sites where they could be properly maintained and operated. The process of death by boiling was considered particularly appropriate for poisoners and counterfeiters, as it symbolically purified their corrupted souls through the application of cleansing heat. The execution of Richard Rose in 1531 provides a detailed example of how boiling was employed as a method of judicial killing. Rose, a cook who had been convicted of attempting to poison the Bishop of Rochester, was sentenced to death by boiling in accordance with a new law specifically enacted to address the crime of poisoning. The execution took place at Smithfield in London, where a large crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. Rose was lowered into the cauldron gradually, allowing the crowd to observe his suffering as the water temperature slowly increased. The entire process took over an hour, during which Rose's screams could be heard throughout the surrounding area. The technical challenges of execution by boiling required considerable expertise and preparation. The cauldron had to be heated gradually to prevent the water from boiling too rapidly, which would cause unconsciousness and death too quickly. The ideal temperature was just below the boiling point, hot enough to cause excruciating pain, but not so hot as to cause immediate death. Executioners developed techniques for testing the water temperature and adjusting the heat to maintain optimal conditions for prolonged suffering. The victim was typically lowered into the water feet first, allowing for a gradual increase in pain as more of the body was submerged. The practice of drawing and quartering represented the most complex and elaborate form of medieval execution, requiring not only specialized equipment, but also careful coordination between multiple executioners and their assistants. The process began with the victim being dragged through the streets, tied to a horse or hurdle, a journey that could cover several miles and take hours to complete. This preliminary torture served both to weaken the victim and to provide entertainment for the crowds that lined the route to the execution site. The actual quartering process required a team of 4 horses, each attached to one of the victim's limbs, along with skilled horsemen who could control the animals to ensure that the dismemberment occurred in the proper sequence and timing. The horses were trained specifically for this purpose, as ordinary animals would not naturally pull in the coordinated manner required for effective quartering. The process was designed to tear the victim's body apart slowly, with the limbs separating from the torso one at a time, while the victim remained conscious to experience the full horror of their dismemberment. The case of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1326 illustrates the elaborate nature of drawing and quartering as practiced in medieval England. Despenser, a favorite of King Edward II who had fallen from grace, was subjected to the full ritual of this most severe form of execution. After being dragged through the streets of Hereford, he was hanged until nearly dead, then lowered and subjected to castration and disembowelment while still conscious. Finally, his body was quartered by horses, with each piece sent to a different city as a warning to other potential traitors. The entire process took most of a day and was witnessed by thousands of spectators. The Iron Maiden, while likely more legend than historical reality, captured the medieval imagination with its promise of death by 1,000 punctures. Descriptions of this device, which supposedly consisted of an iron cabinet lined with spikes that would slowly pierce the victim when the door was closed, appeared in various chronicles and legal documents of the period. Whether or not such devices actually existed, their description in contemporary sources reveals the medieval fascination with elaborate and symbolic forms of execution that combined physical torture with psychological terror. The development of specialized torture devices for extracting confessions represented another area of medieval technological innovation. The rack, which stretched victims until their joints separated, required precise engineering to ensure that the stretching occurred gradually and could be controlled by the operator. The thumb screws, which crushed fingers and toes, were crafted with the precision of fine jewelry to ensure maximum pain with minimal permanent damage. These devices were designed not to kill, but to inflict such excruciating pain that victims would confess to any crime rather than endure continued torture. The Spanish Inquisition perfected many of these torture techniques, developing standardized procedures and equipment that could be replicated across different locations. The Inquisition's manual, the Directorium Inquisitorum, provided detailed instructions for the use of various torture devices, including specific guidelines for how long each technique should be applied and how to recognize when a victim was approaching death. This systematization of torture represented a new level of bureaucratic efficiency applied to the infliction of suffering. The water torture, known as the toka, involved forcing large quantities of water down the victim's throat while they were restrained on an inclined board. This technique, which created the sensation of drowning without actually causing death, could be repeated multiple times and left no permanent physical damage. The psychological effects, however, were devastating, with many victims developing permanent trauma from the experience of repeated near drowning. The economic aspects of torture and execution equipment created a thriving industry of specialized craftsmen who designed and built these devices. Master metal workers competed to create more efficient and spectacular instruments of torture, while executioners traveled between jurisdictions, sharing techniques and innovations. The cost of maintaining and operating these devices was considerable, but the revenue generated by public executions and the political benefits of demonstrating state power made the investment worthwhile for medieval authorities. The training required to operate these complex execution devices created a professional class of executioners who possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy, pain tolerance, and crowd psychology. These men, often working in hereditary positions, developed sophisticated techniques for prolonging suffering while maintaining the theatrical elements that made executions effective as public spectacles. Their expertise was highly valued, and master executioners could command substantial fees for their services. The psychological impact of these elaborate torture devices extended far beyond their actual use, as their mere existence served as a powerful deterrent to potential criminals. The knowledge that transgression could result in hours or days of unimaginable suffering was often more effective than the actual application of these punishments. The devices themselves became symbols of state power, displayed in public squares and courthouses as constant reminders of the consequences of challenging authority. As medieval society evolved, so too did its instruments of torture and execution, with each generation of craftsmen and executioners building upon the innovations of their predecessors. The result was a technological arms race in cruelty that produced increasingly sophisticated and terrifying methods of inflicting pain and death. These devices represented not just the brutality of medieval justice, but also the remarkable ingenuity and technical skill of the craftsmen who created them, revealing a society that applied its finest talents to the art of systematic suffering. The transformation of judicial execution into mass entertainment reached its zenith during the high medieval period, when public executions became elaborate festivals that could draw crowds of tens of thousands and last for days. These events transcended their ostensible purpose of dispensing justice to become complex social rituals that reinforced hierarchies, provided economic opportunities, and satisfied a collective appetite for spectacular violence that permeated every level of medieval society. The execution ground became a theater where the most fundamental dramas of power, morality, and human suffering were played out before audiences that included everyone from peasants to nobility. The execution of Robert-François Damiens in 1757, while technically occurring at the end of the medieval period, represents the culmination of centuries of evolution in public execution as entertainment. Damiens, who had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France, was sentenced to be drawn and quartered in a spectacle that attracted over 100,000 spectators to the Place de Grève in Paris. The execution began at dawn and continued until sunset, with the crowd growing increasingly frenzied as Damiens' suffering intensified. Vendors sold food and drink throughout the day, while pickpockets worked the crowd and prostitutes conducted business in the surrounding streets. The economic impact of major public executions on medieval communities was enormous, with entire industries developing around the provision of services to execution crowds. Innkeepers could charge premium rates for rooms with views of the execution site, while food vendors, ale sellers, and entertainers flocked to execution cities to take advantage of the crowds. The City of London's execution site at Tyburn became so economically important that a permanent infrastructure developed around it, including grandstands for wealthy spectators, refreshment stalls, and even souvenir vendors selling pieces of the rope used in hangings. The social dynamics of execution crowds revealed the complex hierarchies and tensions of medieval society. Wealthy spectators could purchase prime viewing positions in specially constructed galleries, while common people crowded into the general viewing areas. The behavior of different social classes at executions was carefully regulated, with sumptuary laws governing everything from the clothing that could be worn to the types of food that could be consumed. These regulations served to reinforce social distinctions, even in the midst of the supposedly equalizing experience of witnessing death. The role of women in execution crowds was particularly complex, challenging traditional medieval notions of feminine delicacy and moral purity. Contemporary accounts describe women as being among the most enthusiastic and vocal spectators at executions, often calling for increased brutality and showing particular interest in the suffering of condemned criminals. The presence of women at these events was sometimes criticized by moralists, but their participation was generally accepted as a necessary part of the community's collective response to crime and transgression. The execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536 illustrates how gender could complicate the dynamics of public execution. As a queen, Boleyn was entitled to a private execution within the Tower of London rather than the public spectacle that would have been accorded to a common criminal. However, the limited number of witnesses, approximately 1,000, did not diminish the theatrical nature of the event. Boleyn's final speech, her dignified behavior on the scaffold, and the use of a specially imported French swordsman rather than the traditional English axe all contributed to a carefully choreographed performance that served political as well as judicial purposes. The religious dimensions of public executions added another layer of complexity to these events, as they were simultaneously celebrations of earthly justice and preparations for divine judgment. Condemned criminals were expected to participate in elaborate religious rituals, including public confession, prayers for forgiveness, and demonstrations of proper Christian submission to authority. Those who performed these rituals convincingly might receive the mercy of a quicker death, while those who refused or performed inadequately faced additional tortures designed to force compliance. The case of Joan of Arc's execution in 1431 demonstrates how religious and political considerations could transform an execution into a complex theological drama. Joan's trial and execution were carefully orchestrated to discredit her claims of divine inspiration, while reinforcing the authority of both the English occupiers and the Catholic Church. The execution itself was designed to maximize both suffering and symbolic impact, with Joan being burned alive while wearing a paper crown listing her supposed crimes. The event was attended by English nobles, French collaborators, and church officials, all of whom had different reasons for wanting to witness her destruction. The development of execution tourism during the medieval period created new forms of cultural exchange as people traveled great distances to witness particularly notable executions. The execution of William Wallace drew spectators from across Britain and continental Europe, while the burning of heretics during the Spanish Inquisition attracted international audiences curious to witness the latest techniques in judicial torture. These events became opportunities for the exchange of ideas about punishment, justice, and statecraft, contributing to the standardization of execution practices across different jurisdictions. The technological innovations that enhanced the spectacle of public executions included not only the devices used to kill and torture, but also the infrastructure designed to accommodate and control large crowds. Permanent execution sites were constructed with raised platforms to ensure good visibility, while barriers and guard positions were designed to prevent crowd disturbances while maintaining the theatrical atmosphere. The design of these facilities reflected centuries of experience in crowd management and the optimization of spectacle for maximum psychological impact. The role of executioners as public performers added another dimension to the entertainment value of public executions. Master executioners developed distinctive styles and techniques that became their professional signatures, with some becoming celebrities whose presence could guarantee larger crowds and higher revenues. The executioner's costume, tools, and manner of conducting the execution all contributed to the theatrical impact of the event, with successful executioners commanding premium fees for their services. The psychological effects of regular attendance at public executions on medieval populations were profound and lasting. Children who grew up attending executions as routine community events developed a normalized relationship with extreme violence that shaped their understanding of justice, authority, and human nature. The collective trauma of witnessing systematic brutality was channeled into support for the existing social order, as the alternative, being subjected to such treatment oneself, was too terrifying to contemplate. The documentation of public executions in contemporary chronicles, legal records, and personal accounts provides detailed insight into the actual experience of these events. The Nuremberg Chronicle, the London Chronicles, and numerous other sources describe executions with remarkable attention to detail, noting everything from the weather conditions to the behavior of individual spectators. These records reveal that medieval society was deeply invested in the documentation and analysis of execution spectacles, treating them as important cultural events worthy of careful recording. The international competition between different jurisdictions to stage the most spectacular executions led to an escalation in both the brutality and the theatrical elements of these events. Rulers competed to devise new forms of punishment that would demonstrate their power while providing unprecedented entertainment for their subjects. This competition drove innovation in execution techniques and contributed to the spread of new methods across different regions and kingdoms. The decline of public execution as mass entertainment began during the Renaissance, as changing attitudes toward violence and the emergence of new forms of popular entertainment reduced the appeal of execution spectacle. However, the legacy of medieval execution culture persisted in various forms, influencing everything from theatrical traditions to popular literature. The transformation of judicial killing from private punishment to public entertainment and back to private procedure reflects broader changes in medieval society's relationship with violence, authority, and collective identity. The ultimate impact of medieval execution culture extended far beyond the immediate effects on those who witnessed or participated in these events. The normalization of extreme violence as entertainment, the association of justice with spectacular suffering, and the use of public brutality as a tool of social control all contributed to patterns of behavior and belief that would persist long after the medieval period ended. The spectacle of death had become so deeply embedded in European culture that its influence can still be traced in modern attitudes toward punishment, justice, and the role of violence in maintaining social order. The medieval period's transformation of execution into entertainment represents one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of human civilization, revealing the capacity of organized society to systematize and celebrate extreme cruelty. The crowds that gathered to witness these spectacles were not aberrant or exceptional, but representative of a culture that had learned to find pleasure in the suffering of others and to justify that pleasure as moral necessity. The legacy of this period serves as a reminder of how quickly civilized society can descend into barbarism when violence is normalized and cruelty is celebrated as virtue.